This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. The sun had barely risen over Colton Creek, Ohio, on the morning of April 23rd, when the tranquility of the rural town was shattered forever. The fields were still cloaked in mist, and the town's early risers went about their routines in peace, unaware of the horror waiting to be uncovered. By noon, Colton Creek would no longer be a quiet farming community but the epicenter of the most gruesome crime in the state's history, a place defined not by its sprawling farmlands and neighborly charm but by blood-soaked tragedy. It began when Linda Mayfield, a family friend of the Harlows, arrived at their property just off Pinneridge Lane. She had stopped by as she often did, planning to feed the chickens and drop off fresh baked goods. But as she approached the first of the Harlow family's 3 mobile homes, she noticed something was wrong. The air felt heavier, the kind of oppressive stillness that makes even birds fall silent. The front door of the home, usually left ajar for airflow, was locked tight. The Harlow family dogs, normally boisterous and barking at the sight of a visitor, were nowhere to be seen. Using the spare key the Harlows had entrusted to her, Linda unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood. She called out, her voice trembling, but the only response was an unnerving silence. Her gaze fell to the floor, where a trail of dark, dried streaks led her toward the master bedroom. What she found inside would haunt her forever. Christopher Harlow Sr., the family patriarch, lay sprawled on the floor in a pool of blood, his face battered and unrecognizable. Beside him was Gary Harlow, his younger brother, slumped lifelessly against the wall. Both men had been shot multiple times, their bodies bearing the marks of a brutal attack. Linda fled the house in a panic, dialing 911 as her hands shook uncontrollably. Her frantic voice cracked as she tried to explain what she had seen, the words tumbling out in fragments. The dispatcher urged her to stay outside and wait for help, but Linda couldn't resist her growing fear for the other members of the Harlow family. She ran across the property to the second mobile home, belonging to Christopher Jr., known as CJ. This home was where CJ lived with his fiancée, Amber Gilly, their 6-month-old baby, and CJ's 3-year-old son from a previous relationship. As Linda approached, her heart sank further when she noticed the front door was slightly ajar. Inside, the scene was even more horrifying. CJ and Amber were in their bed, the blood-soaked sheets clinging to their bodies. Their 6-month-old baby sat beside them, patting at CJ's chest as though trying to wake him up, his tiny hands smeared with blood. In the doorway, the 3-year-old stood silently, his wide, tear-filled eyes staring blankly at Linda. Paralyzed by the sight, Linda stumbled backward, tears streaming down her face as her mind raced to comprehend the sheer brutality of what she was witnessing. She scooped up the unharmed children and carried them outside, calling 911 again to report more deaths. But the nightmare wasn't over. Shortly after Linda's second call, James Harlow, Christopher Sr.'s brother, arrived at the scene after hearing the news. Against police orders to wait, he ventured into the third home on the property, belonging to Christopher Sr.'s estranged wife, Dana, who had maintained a close relationship with her ex-husband despite their separation. Inside, James discovered Dana dead in her bedroom, shot multiple times in her sleep. In the next room, he found the bodies of 2 of her children, Hannah, just 19 years old, and her younger brother, 16-year-old Mark. Both teenagers had been shot execution-style in their beds. Hannah's newborn baby, only 4 days old, lay beside her, alive but drenched in her mother's blood. The sheer scope of the massacre was incomprehensible. In less than an hour, police had uncovered 7 bodies across the Harlow property, all executed with cold precision. The air around the home seemed to hum with dread, the weight of death pressing down on everyone present. But the horror did not end there. Several miles away, Kenneth Harlow, Christopher Sr.'s older brother, was found dead in his small cabin. A neighbor, alarmed by the news spreading through the town, had gone to check on him and stumbled upon another grisly scene. Kenneth had been shot once in the head, his body left slumped over a table covered in cash. The display seemed deliberate, as though the killer had wanted to leave a message. By the end of the day, Colton Creek was in chaos. The media descended on the town, their cameras capturing the somber faces of neighbors gathered at the edges of the crime scene. Helicopters buzzed overhead, broadcasting live footage of the Harlow property. The small sheriff's department, unaccustomed to handling crimes of this magnitude, called in reinforcements from state and federal agencies. The initial investigation revealed unsettling details. Most of the victims appeared to have been killed in their sleep, their bodies undisturbed except for the blood pooling beneath them. The killings were methodical, with each shot placed precisely. No signs of forced entry were found at any of the homes, suggesting the victims had known their killer or killers. Adding to the mystery was the presence of marijuana grow operations on the property, concealed in sheds and greenhouses. The discovery led investigators to consider the possibility of a drug-related motive, perhaps a warning or retaliation from a rival group. The surviving children, 3-year-old Brentley, 6-month-old Mason, and 4-day-old Kylie, were placed into emergency protective custody, their futures uncertain. The image of Kylie, just days old and lying beside her murdered mother, became the haunting face of the tragedy, a stark reminder of the innocence lost in the violence. For the residents of Colton Creek, the murders marked the end of their town's innocence. Doors that had once been left unlocked were now bolted shut. Neighbors who had known each other for decades began looking over their shoulders, wondering if the killer was among them. The Harlow family had been a fixture in the community, hardworking, deeply connected, and seemingly without enemies. The idea that someone could execute them so brutally in their own beds was unimaginable. As the sun set on Colton Creek that day, the town was left to grapple with its new identity, a place no longer defined by its fields and forests, but by the 8 lives taken in the dead of night. The Harlow family's name would become synonymous with tragedy, their story etched into Ohio's dark history as a chilling reminder of how quickly a quiet life can turn into a nightmare. The Harlow property spanned several acres of remote farmland, surrounded by dense woods that swallowed any sounds from the world beyond. On a typical day, the area exuded a tranquil simplicity, its unpaved paths leading to modest mobile homes and outbuildings that stood in quiet testimony to the family's rural lifestyle. But on the morning of April 23rd, the land had become a grim tableau, soaked in death and silence. The scene that greeted law enforcement officers was one of unparalleled brutality, a massacre so calculated and precise that it suggested a darkness far deeper than a simple crime of passion. The first home belonged to Christopher Harlow Sr., the family patriarch. It was a single wide trailer that bore all the hallmarks of a hardworking man's life, tools stacked neatly by the porch, boots caked with dirt by the front door. Inside, the scent of blood hung heavy in the air, metallic and cloying, mixing with the faint, acrid tang of gunpowder. Christopher's body lay on the floor in the master bedroom, his once strong frame crumpled and broken. Blood had pooled beneath him, congealing into a dark, viscous mass that spread out across the hardwood. His face was barely recognizable, his features obliterated by the sheer violence of the attack. He had been shot multiple times at close range, the precision of the wounds indicating that the killer had taken their time. Nearby, Gary Harlow, Christopher's younger brother, sat slumped against the wall, his lifeless eyes staring blankly ahead. A fine mist of blood spattered the wallpaper behind him, the result of a single gunshot to the head. His position suggested he had been sitting when the attack began, perhaps caught off guard by the sudden intrusion. The 2 brothers had likely been the first targets, their deaths setting the tone for what was to come. Across the yard, just a short walk from Christopher S.R.'s home, stood the trailer where Christopher Jr., known as CJ, lived with his fiancée, Amber Gilley. This home was a stark contrast to the first, with baby toys scattered across the porch and colorful flower pots lining the windowsills. Inside, the scene was no less horrific. CJ and Amber lay in their bed, their bodies tangled in a final embrace. Blood soaked through the mattress, dripping onto the floor in thick rivulets. Amber's hand rested limply against CJ's chest, as if she had tried to shield him in her last moments. Beside them, their 6-month-old son Mason sat in his blood-streaked pajamas, patting at his father's unmoving chest. The innocence of his actions was a sharp, gut-wrenching contrast to the violence that surrounded him. Nearby, CJ's 3-year-old son Brentley stood in the doorway, his small frame dwarfed by the enormity of what he had witnessed. His face was blank, his eyes wide and unblinking, as though he had already shut himself off from the horror. The third home, belonging to Dana Harlow, was nestled at the edge of the property, its windows framed by tattered curtains that fluttered weakly in the breeze. Dana's lifeless body was found in her bedroom, her arms splayed across the mattress, as though she had been reaching for something, or someone when the shots rang out. Her nightgown was soaked in blood, the fabric clinging to her cooling skin. In the next room, her 2 youngest children lay in their beds, their lives extinguished as they slept. Hannah, just 19 years old, was curled on her side, her long hair matted with blood. Her newborn daughter, Kylie, lay nestled against her chest, miraculously unharmed. The baby's tiny cries were the only sound in the room when officers arrived, a fragile voice cutting through the suffocating stillness. Mark, Hannah's 16-year-old brother, was sprawled on his back in the adjacent room, a bullet hole marring the smooth expanse of his forehead. Miles away, Kenneth Harlow's cabin stood isolated at the end of a winding dirt road, its surroundings dense with overgrown trees. His home bore the same marks of humble, rural life: rusted tools, empty cans of chewing tobacco, and a single rocking chair on the porch. Inside, Kenneth's body was slumped over the kitchen table, his head resting in a pool of blood that gleamed dully in the dim light filtering through the curtains. Scattered around him were crumpled bills and loose change, as though the killer had left them intentionally. It was a macabre display, a message meant to taunt and confuse. The level of precision and coordination across the crime scenes was staggering. Most of the victims appeared to have been killed in their sleep, their bodies undisturbed except for the violent marks left by the bullets. The killers had used suppressors, ensuring that the shots wouldn't carry through the still night air. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture or broken glass to suggest resistance. The only sounds that night had likely been the muffled pops of gunfire and the killer's steady, deliberate movements. Each home was a self-contained nightmare, but taken together, the scenes painted a picture of chilling ruthlessness. The killers had moved from one location to the next with almost mechanical efficiency, eliminating their targets in a sequence that suggested intimate knowledge of the family's routines. They knew where each person would be, who would be most vulnerable, and how to avoid detection. Even the dogs, normally fierce protectors of the property, had been silenced. Investigators later found traces of sedatives in their food bowls, the killers having neutralized them before beginning their spree. Outside, the Harlow property was swarming with law enforcement, their voices hushed as they documented the carnage. The flashing red and blue lights of patrol cars cast eerie shadows across the blood-stained ground, illuminating every gruesome detail. Officers moved methodically, marking evidence and photographing each body with a grim sense of duty. The media, already descending on the town, hovered at the edge of the property line, their cameras hungrily capturing the chaos. Inside the homes, forensic teams worked tirelessly to piece together the events of the night. Blood spatter patterns told a story of methodical execution, each victim taken out with precision shots to vital areas. Shell casings were collected and cataloged, their placement suggesting the killers had used multiple firearms. Boot prints, faint but distinct, led from one trailer to the next, their shallow impressions in the dirt speaking of deliberate, calculated movements. The most haunting discovery came in the form of subtle tampering. Security cameras placed around the property had been disabled, their wires cut with surgical precision. It was clear the killers had planned every detail, from the timing of the attacks to the routes they would take between homes. Even the scattered cash at Kenneth's cabin, initially thought to be a robbery motive, seemed more like a deliberate misdirection, a cruel attempt to obscure the true purpose behind the slaughter. As dawn broke over Colton Creek, the crime scene became a grim monument to the loss of innocence. The Harlow family, once the backbone of the community, had been wiped out in a single night, their homes turned into charnel houses. The surviving children, too young to understand the full weight of the tragedy, were taken into protective custody, their cries echoing faintly as they were carried away from the blood-soaked ruins of their lives. The scene left an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed it. Officers, hardened by years of experience, struggled to maintain their composure as they documented the unimaginable violence. Neighbors, gathered at the edge of the property, wept openly, their faces pale with shock. And as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the land, it became clear to everyone that this was not just a crime, it was a calculated act of evil that would haunt Colton Creek forever. Colton Creek was a town that prided itself on its sense of unity. Tucked away in the rural heart of Ohio, it was the kind of place where everyone knew one another, where neighbors helped fix fences, and children played in the open fields until the sun dipped below the horizon. The Harlow family had been a cornerstone of that community, a multi-generational clan known for their hard work, generosity, and strong family ties. But after the massacre, the town's image of itself began to unravel. The crime didn't just take 8 lives, it stole the soul of Colton Creek. The news of the murders spread like wildfire, carried first by whispers among neighbors, and then by the blaring sirens of police cars speeding down the quiet dirt roads. As details began to emerge, disbelief gave way to horror. The sheer brutality of the killings left the community reeling. 8 people, all from the same family, executed in their homes while they slept. It was the kind of violence that seemed unimaginable, more fitting for a crime novel or horror movie than their serene, tight-knit town. Fear settled over Colton Creek like a suffocating fog. Doors that had never been locked before were now bolted tight. Windows were shuttered, curtains drawn against the outside world. Guns were taken out of storage, cleaned and loaded, their cold weight a new and unwelcome presence in homes where they had long been forgotten. Parents walked their children to school, their eyes darting toward every unfamiliar car or shadow. The community had always operated on trust, but now even the closest neighbors eyed one another with suspicion. The Harlow property became a grim spectacle, its once welcoming yards now cordoned off with police tape and patrolled by officers who stood guard like sentinels. The sight of flashing lights and forensic vans was a constant reminder that the town was no longer a sanctuary. People gathered at the edge of the property, their faces pale and lined with worry, desperate for answers but afraid of what they might hear. The most unsettling part was the silence. The usual hum of the countryside chirping crickets, barking dogs, the distant roar of a tractor was absent. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath. Rumors began to spread, each more outlandish than the last. Some whispered about a drug cartel, pointing to the marijuana grow operations discovered on the property as evidence of a deadly retaliation. Others speculated about a family feud, old grievances that had boiled over into murder. There were even those who believed it was the work of an outsider, a transient who had drifted into town unnoticed and left chaos in their wake. The lack of concrete answers only fueled the paranoia. At church services that Sunday, the pews were filled to capacity. Prayers were offered for the souls of the Harlow family, and the congregation wept openly as the names of the victims were read aloud. But even the comforting familiarity of faith couldn't ease the unease that had settled over the town. As people filed out of the chapel, their whispered conversations were tinged with dread. Who could have done this? And more importantly, were they still out there? The children of Colton Creek, shielded as best as possible from the grisly details, felt the tension acutely. Their once carefree play was now cautious, their laughter subdued. Parents kept them close, forbidding them from wandering far. At school, teachers struggled to maintain a sense of normalcy, their voices cracking as they tried to lead lessons while glancing anxiously at the clock. The children asked questions that had no easy answers. Why did this happen? Who would do such a thing? Were they safe? Local businesses, too, felt the weight of the tragedy. The diner where the Harlows had once been regulars saw its tables go empty. Conversations at the hardware store, the post office, and the barbershop were hushed, each patron trying to make sense of the senseless. The once bustling farmers' market was eerily quiet, the usual camaraderie replaced by a stifling apprehension. The Harlow family had been woven into the fabric of the town, and their absence left a gaping wound. In the days following the massacre, candlelight vigils were held in the town square. Hundreds gathered, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of flickering flames. They held hands, prayed, and sang hymns, their voices trembling with sorrow. The youngest of the Harlow survivors, baby Kylie, 6-month-old Mason, and 3-year-old Brentley, became symbols of resilience, their survival offering a glimmer of hope amid the darkness. But even the sight of the children brought a bittersweet ache. They had been spared, but at what cost? The funeral services for the Harlow family were devastating in their finality. 8 caskets lined the front of the chapel, each draped in flowers that did little to soften the grim reality. Friends and relatives stood to speak, their voices breaking as they shared memories of laughter, love, and loss. Christopher S.R., the family patriarch, was remembered as a man who would give the shirt off his back to anyone in need. Dana was praised for her kindness and strength, her devotion to her children unwavering. Hannah, CJ, Amber, Gary, Mark, and Kenneth were each honored for their unique contributions to the family and the community. But even as they grieved, the mourners couldn't escape the question that loomed over the service: why? Law enforcement faced mounting pressure as days turned into weeks with no arrests. The lack of answers gnawed at the town's already fragile sense of security. Investigators assured the public they were following every lead, but the complexity of the case made progress agonizingly slow. Each press conference brought more frustration than relief, the updates vague and unsatisfying. The town's trust in its leaders began to erode. Some accused the sheriff's department of incompetence, demanding that the FBI take over the investigation. Others pointed fingers at one another, their paranoia growing as the case dragged on. Lifelong friendships crumbled under the weight of suspicion, neighbors accusing neighbors in whispers that grew louder as fear turned to desperation. As the first anniversary of the murders approached, Colton Creek was a shadow of its former self. The fields still stretched wide and open, the woods still loomed tall, but the spirit of the town had been irrevocably changed. The memory of that hollow night lingered in every corner, a constant reminder that even in the most idyllic places, darkness could take root. And in the silence of their grief, the people of Colton Creek waited. For answers. For justice. For the day when they might finally feel safe again. The investigation into the Harlow family massacre began under the glare of police lights and the watchful eyes of a terrified town. The sheer scale of the crime was unprecedented for Colton Creek, and the local sheriff's department was woefully unequipped to handle the complexity of what they were about to uncover. 8 lives taken in one night, across multiple homes, with no apparent witnesses and a killer or killers who had vanished without a trace. The initial hours were chaotic. Sheriff Emmett Klein, a grizzled officer with decades of experience but nothing close to this level of violence, stood in the thick of it, barking orders to his overwhelmed deputies. The first task was to secure the scene: 3 homes on the Harlow property, and a cabin miles away where Kenneth Harlow's body had been found. Yellow tape fluttered weakly in the wind as officers moved cautiously through the blood-soaked interiors, their boots crunching over spent shell casings and dried pools of gore. The murder weapons were missing, and the killers had left behind few clues. The brutality of the crime suggested rage, but the precision told a different story. Each victim had been shot multiple times, most while they slept. The use of suppressors meant the killers were professionals, or at least had planned carefully enough to avoid detection. But why? What motive could drive such calculated carnage? As the crime scenes were processed, the evidence painted a chilling picture. Shell casings from at least 3 different firearms were collected, suggesting multiple assailants. Blood spatter analysis revealed the victims had been killed in rapid succession, with little time for struggle or resistance. Footprints, faint but distinguishable in the dirt between the trailers, indicated the killers had moved methodically from one home to the next. The killers had disabled the security cameras on the property, cutting wires with surgical precision. This detail haunted the investigators. Someone had known exactly how to navigate the Harlow property, had studied its vulnerabilities, and had exploited them with cold efficiency. The discovery of marijuana grow operations on the property added another layer of complexity. Hidden in sheds and concealed beneath tarps, the plants were in various stages of cultivation. The largest grow site housed over 2,000 plants, a scale far beyond what would be considered personal use. This revelation shattered the image of the Harlow family as simple farmers. Investigators wondered if the killings were the result of a drug deal gone wrong, or perhaps a cartel sending a brutal message. But the drug angle didn't fully align with the evidence. The cash scattered around Kenneth's body at his cabin was inconsistent with a professional hit. It felt staged, like a clumsy attempt to mislead investigators. The rest of the crime scenes were too meticulous to match the chaotic nature of a drug-related execution. It was a thread, but it wasn't the whole story. Interviews with the surviving children yielded no answers. The 3-year-old Brentley could barely speak about what he had seen, his tiny voice cracking as he tried to describe the shadows moving through his home. The 6-month-old and the newborn were too young to understand their miraculous survival, their cries filling the sterile air of the protective custody facility where they were taken. As days turned into weeks, the case grew colder. Leads dried up. The local community, desperate for answers, grew restless. A $250,000 reward was announced, leading to an influx of tips, but most were dead ends, paranoia, and rumors disguised as information. The investigation took a turn when forensic analysts uncovered traces of concrete residue on the footprint impressions near the Harlow property. This finding, paired with fragments of construction-grade materials found in nearby woods, suggested the killers had taken steps to conceal their weapons after the crime. A search of the surrounding area revealed a shallow pond, its murky water hiding a cache of cement-encased objects. Inside the blocks were makeshift gun suppressors, bullet casings, and disassembled firearms. The sophistication of the weapons cache pointed to someone with experience in constructing and hiding tools of violence. The suppressors were handcrafted, their parts sourced from common household items, but their construction was expert level. Investigators began compiling a profile. The killers were resourceful, meticulous, and deeply connected to the Harlow family. Attention turned to the Harlow family's relationships. What emerged was a tangled web of grievances and unresolved conflicts. The family, once thought to be a symbol of unity, had its share of secrets. Financial disputes between Christopher Sassar and his brother Kenneth surfaced, along with whispers of infidelity and bitter rivalries over land ownership. But the most troubling revelation came from Christopher S.R.'s daughter, Hannah. Investigators discovered messages she had posted online weeks before her death, alluding to a custody battle with her ex-boyfriend, Jacob Langley. The posts were filled with veiled threats and ominous warnings. In one chilling entry, she wrote, "They'll have to kill me first before they take my baby." The Langley family was well known in Colton Creek, but not for good reasons. They were wealthy and insular, rarely mingling with others outside their circle. Jacob Langley's relationship with Hannah had been tumultuous, with accusations of controlling behavior and threats to take custody of their daughter. When Hannah moved back in with her mother, Dana, tensions between the two families escalated. Surveillance of the Langley family began quietly. Investigators noted their movements, tracked their financial records, and listened to intercepted communications. A pattern emerged: large purchases of firearms, cement bags, and electronic signal jammers in the months leading up to the murders. The breakthrough came when a receipt for a pair of work boots matched the sole impressions found at the crime scene. The purchase had been made at a hardware store 2 days before the murders by Angela Langley, Jacob's mother. Search warrants were executed at the Langley family's sprawling estate. What investigators found confirmed their worst suspicions. Laptops contained forged custody documents for Hannah's daughter, clearly intended to forcefully strip her of her parental rights. Detailed maps of the Harlow property were discovered, annotated with notes about camera placements and entry points. In the barn, buried beneath piles of hay, were more suppressor materials and partially assembled weapons. The most damning evidence came from the family's cell phones. Deleted text messages, painstakingly recovered by digital forensics experts, revealed chilling conversations between Jacob, Angela, and Jacob's father, Carl. The texts outlined a plan to eliminate the problem and ensure no loose ends. On the anniversary of the murders, arrest warrants were issued for Jacob, Angela, Carl, and Jacob's brother, Grant. The Langley family's carefully constructed facade crumbled under the weight of the evidence. They were charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and tampering with evidence. As they were led from their estate in handcuffs, the townsfolk of Colton Creek gathered in stunned silence. The faces they saw were not strangers, not outsiders. They were people they had known, waved to in passing, even shared meals with. The realization was as devastating as the crime itself. The horror that had shattered their town had come from within. By the time the arrests were made, the truth about the Harlow family massacre was no longer just a web of suspicion. It was a dark, pulsating knot of horror, tightening around the Langley family with every new piece of evidence. The people of Colton Creek had long suspected that the killer was one of their own, but the depth of planning and malice behind the murders defied even the wildest rumors. As the trial of Jacob Langley and his family approached, the full, harrowing details of the crime began to emerge. It was the cold precision of the Langley family's actions that sent shivers through the courtroom. Testimonies, forensic evidence, and recovered digital files painted a portrait of a family consumed by obsession, a collective mind fixated on control and domination. It wasn't just a killing, it was an annihilation, carefully orchestrated over months to destroy the Harlow family down to its youngest members. The murders began under the cover of darkness on April 23rd. By then, the Langleys had already executed every detail of their plan. Jacob, his mother Angela, his father Carl, and his older brother Grant worked together like a finely tuned machine, each playing their role without hesitation. The suppressors they had constructed muffled the sound of their gunshots, ensuring that no one in the isolated farmland would hear the carnage unfolding. The first target was Christopher Harlow SR. He was the strongest of the family and the one most likely to fight back if he awoke. The Langleys knew his routine. He kept a loaded shotgun by his bedside and always locked his door before going to sleep. But the killers also knew about the spare key hidden beneath the rotting welcome mat. They slipped into his trailer without a sound, disabling the security cameras in less than a minute. Christopher SR never had a chance. The first shot ripped through his chest as he sat up in bed, blood spraying across the headboard and walls. His brother Gary, startled awake, was silenced before he could even scream. Both men lay in pools of their own blood, their bodies illuminated only by the faint glow of the bedside lamp that had been knocked over in the struggle. The killers moved to the next trailer, where CJ and Amber were asleep with their infant son Mason. CJ's 3-year-old son Brentley had fallen asleep on the couch, his small form curled under a blanket. Angela stayed behind to act as a lookout while Jacob, Carl, and Grant entered the home. They worked quickly, their boots muffled by the thick carpet as they crept toward the bedrooms. CJ was the first to die, shot twice in the chest before he could reach for the knife he kept hidden under his pillow. Amber awoke just in time to see Jacob's silhouette looming over her, the muzzle of the gun glinting in the moonlight. The killers left the children alive, a calculated decision meant to confuse investigators and sow doubt about the motive behind the massacre. By the time they reached Dana Harlow's home, the killers were emboldened. They knew that once Dana and her children were dead, there would be no one left to fight their custody claims over Jacob's daughter. Dana was shot twice in the head while she slept, her body rolling off the bed and onto the floor. In the adjacent rooms, Hannah and her younger brother Mark were dispatched with equal efficiency. Hannah's newborn daughter, Kylie, was found crying in the crook of her mother's arm, drenched in blood but otherwise unharmed. The final target was Kenneth Harlow, Christopher S.R.'s older brother. He lived miles away in a secluded cabin, and the killers saved him for last to ensure he couldn't interfere with their plans. Kenneth's death was particularly brutal, his execution staged to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. The cash scattered around his body was a deliberate touch, meant to mislead investigators into believing the murders were linked to the Harlow family's hidden marijuana grow operation. What the Langleys didn't account for was the weight of their own arrogance. As careful as they had been, small mistakes began to unravel their plan. Boot prints traced back to their estate. Receipts for suppressor materials and cement linked them to the weapons cache found submerged in the pond. And then there were the text messages, dozens of them, retrieved from Jacob's and Angela's phones discussing every detail of the crime. During the trial, these messages were read aloud to a courtroom packed with mourners, reporters, and townsfolk desperate for justice. The texts were cold and clinical, written without a hint of remorse. Angela directed her family like a general commanding troops, detailing who should disable the cameras, who should carry the suppressors, and how the bodies should be positioned to avoid suspicion. Jacob's replies were chillingly matter-of-fact, often punctuated with casual affirmations like "got it" or "consider it done." The most damning piece of evidence came from Hannah Harlow herself. Days before her murder, she had confided in a friend through a private social media message, expressing her fear that Jacob would do something drastic if she didn't agree to his custody demands. "They'll have to kill me first," she wrote, a line that would echo through the trial like a ghostly warning ignored too late. As the jury deliberated, the weight of the evidence left little room for doubt. The Langleys were convicted on all counts, 8 charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and tampering with evidence. Each member of the family received life sentences without the possibility of parole, their fates sealed by the same cold finality with which they had ended the lives of the Harlow family. The sentencing hearings were a spectacle of grief and anger. Family members of the victims took the stand, their voices cracking as they spoke of the lives cut short, the children who would never know their parents, the empty spaces at dinner tables that would never be filled. Jacob Langley sat stone-faced, his lack of remorse a final insult to the grieving town. Angela, once the domineering matriarch of the Langley family, wept openly but never apologized. As the verdicts were read, a palpable tension broke in the courtroom. Some wept with relief, while others sat in stunned silence, the reality of the tragedy settling over them like a suffocating weight. Outside, the crowd gathered around the courthouse erupted into a mixture of cheers and tears, their collective grief finding a small measure of solace in the knowledge that justice had been served. But for Colton Creek, the scars would never fully heal. The Harlow property remained empty, a haunting reminder of the night when darkness descended on the town. The surviving children, now wards of the state, were relocated far away, their lives forever shadowed by the memories they would never fully escape. And in the quiet hours of the night, long after the courtroom emptied and the Langley family was locked away, the people of Colton Creek were left with a question that no sentence could answer: how could anyone have done this to their own? Colton Creek did not return to normal after the convictions. The air felt different, heavier, as if the town itself had absorbed the horror of what had happened and could not shake it. The Harlow family's murder had left a scar on the community, one that no verdict or sentence could ever heal. The lingering effects of that night seeped into every corner of life, twisting relationships, fraying nerves, and turning the once tight-knit town into a fractured shadow of what it had been. The Harlow property became a haunting ground for memory and tragedy. The trailers stood vacant, their windows boarded up, their yards overgrown with weeds that grew thicker with each passing month. No one dared approach the land, even after the police tape was taken down and the investigators moved on. Local children whispered stories of ghosts and curses, daring each other to touch the rusted chain that still hung on the front gate. The few who ventured close swore they heard whispers in the wind, faint cries that stopped abruptly as if silenced. The surviving children of the Harlow family were taken far from Colton Creek, their names changed, their new locations kept secret. Kylie, the newborn, would never know the mother who had held her close as she died. Mason and Brentley, too young to fully understand what had happened, bore invisible scars that would reveal themselves only in time. For the people of Colton Creek, the absence of these children was a wound that festered, a reminder that the future had been stolen from their town along with the Harlows. The Langley family, now serving life sentences, became a symbol of everything the town feared about itself. Their sprawling estate, once a display of power and wealth, was left abandoned. Windows shattered from neglect, vines creeping up its walls like fingers claiming the home for nature. No one would buy the land, and rumors spread that the fields surrounding the house were cursed. The stories varied. Some said crops refused to grow, others claimed to have seen figures walking the grounds at night, their faces obscured by darkness. Angela Langley's reputation as the mastermind behind the massacre loomed over the town like a storm cloud. Even in prison, her name carried a sinister weight. The matriarch had controlled her family with an iron grip, bending them to her will, and it was this image of control that terrified people most. The idea that a single person could orchestrate such a horrifying chain of events was a nightmare that stuck in the back of everyone's mind. Jacob Langley's face, once familiar and unremarkable, became the embodiment of evil for the residents of Colton Creek. His lack of remorse throughout the trial haunted those who had sat in the courtroom, his empty gaze a chilling reminder of how far hatred and obsession could go. People whispered about the way he had smiled when the verdict was read, a fleeting but unmistakable expression that seemed to suggest he had not lost but merely changed the rules of the game. The trial itself left lasting damage on the town. Witnesses who had testified against the Langleys became pariahs in their own community, their bravery overshadowed by fear. Some packed up and left, unable to bear the sideways glances and hushed voices that followed them wherever they went. Others stayed, but their lives were marked by paranoia and isolation. People who once trusted each other without question now second-guessed every interaction. For Sheriff Emmett Klein, the case was both his greatest achievement and his deepest failure. The conviction of the Langleys brought justice, but it came too late for the Harlows. He spent his remaining years haunted by the faces of the victims, his thoughts circling back to the what-ifs that had plagued him since that hollow night. He rarely spoke of the case in public, but those who knew him well could see the toll it had taken. The local church became a place of uneasy solace. Vigils for the Harlow family were held monthly, their numbers dwindling over time but never disappearing entirely. Candles burned on the altar, their flames trembling as though they too carried the weight of the tragedy. Prayers filled the sanctuary, but there was an edge to them, a desperation that came from trying to reconcile faith with such a senseless loss. The media, hungry for fresh angles, painted Colton Creek as a town defined by its tragedy. Journalists descended on the town at anniversaries, poking at the wounds that had barely begun to heal. They interviewed tearful neighbors and grieving relatives, their questions sharp and unrelenting. Colton Creek became a spectacle, a cautionary tale of small-town darkness, its name forever tied to the worst night in its history. Local businesses suffered under the weight of the town's notoriety. The diner where the Harlow family had once gathered for Sunday breakfast saw fewer customers, its booths sitting empty for hours at a time. The farmers' market, once a lively hub of activity, became a quiet, somber affair. Tourists who had once passed through Colton Creek on their way to nearby attractions now avoided it entirely, the shadow of the murders too heavy for them to ignore. For those who remained, life in Colton Creek became a delicate balancing act. Parents kept their children close, their fear manifesting in curfews and overprotective rules. Neighbors who had once left their doors unlocked now installed deadbolts and security cameras. The sense of community that had once defined the town was gone, replaced by a pervasive sense of mistrust. The anniversary of the murders became a somber ritual. Flowers and candles were left at the edge of the Harlow property, the makeshift memorial growing larger each year. People gathered in silence, their faces etched with grief, their eyes heavy with the knowledge that no amount of time could erase the memory of that night. The tragedy had become a part of Colton Creek's identity, an indelible mark that would linger long after those who remembered it were gone. The Langleys had succeeded in tearing apart the Harlow family, but their actions had done something far greater. They had torn apart Colton Creek itself. The town, once a place of unity and trust, now stood as a testament to the fragility of human connections. The massacre wasn't just a crime, it was a lesson, one written in blood and pain, and it was one that Colton Creek would never forget.